America is massive. I've been thinking a lot recently about American identity and how the geography of this great continent we call home informs that identity. The continental United States is larger in land area than the entire European Union, with an incredible array of different landscapes whose diversity is unrivaled by that of almost any other country. We are 8,800 feet above sea level, and Lily had never seen mountains before. There are clouds way below us. We went on a trip out west, visiting Salt Lake City, Zion National Park, and the north rim of the Grand Canyon to better understand the role of the old frontier and the myth surrounding it on America's self-conception. I've lived in South Florida for most of my life, a place whose unique landscape is certainly not without its merit, but in all honesty, I've always found it a bit lacking. In the last few years, I've been enamored by the idea of the Great American West, this land of natural marvels, unlike anything you can see here on the East Coast. Romantic notions of the Western United States are of course inseparable from that of the American frontier myth. The idea of wide open spaces filled with nothing but opportunity for any individual ambitious enough to harness it. There is an inherent conflict between romanticization of the American frontier and its basis in white supremacy. This wasn't just settlers venturing off into open space, it was the conquering of land where indigenous people lived. This isn't a comprehensive history of the American frontier. That's a subject I still need to study much more in depth myself, but instead an exploration of its place in the American consciousness and national character. In many ways, the story of the American West is a story of suffering that both our nation and our national identity were built upon. Theodore Roosevelt is famous for being an outdoorsman. He was an avid hunter and conservationist who established the national park system. Contrary to our popular perception of him, Roosevelt had been a sickly child with a bad case of asthma. But he would take it upon himself to build up his body and spirit into one fit for the image we have of him today. He was born into a wealthy New York family far away from the heights of the Rocky Mountains or depths of the Grand Canyon. Yet, the young Roosevelt was enamored by tales of the West. He began to idolize the hunters, cowboys, and soldiers that would give him a blueprint for the kind of man he wanted to be. The future president made his first trip out west in 1883, traveling by train to the Badlands in the Dakotas. The land was inhospitable, with no clean drinking water and days of rainstorms. Roosevelt even offered his guide a bonus to get him to go on despite the difficult conditions. Roosevelt was on the hunt for the buffalo, a pursuit that became increasingly difficult as the large herds that had once roamed the West vanished with the rising number of settlers. TR danced with joy once he finally caught the illustrious animal. It was on this trip where he began to embody the image of the American cowboy, buying his own cattle ranch and learning to do both the practical day-to-day work of the over-glamorized Americana figure and the acts of heroism that were so often embellished in popular culture. As fun as it is to embrace Roosevelt as an American icon and personality, he was a deeply flawed man, one whose romanticization runs parallel to that of the frontier myth as a whole. He wrote a 4-volume series called The Winning of the West, which played into the myth of the American frontier, heavily pushing the idea of westward expansion as righteous conquest over what he saw as a savage land. He was a man of his era, an imperialist and white supremacist who, despite these things, remains one of the most captivating personalities in the American canon. By 1890, the American West has become so settled that the Census Bureau officially declared that the frontier was over. In the 100 years that followed, what would be known as the American Century, this nation expanded its horizons far beyond what any of the founders could have envisioned.
From Manhattan towers to towering pines, a Marlboro legend grew. Till today, it's the brand that won the West and the rest of the country, too. Come to where the flavor is. Come to Marlboro country.
Only 79 years after the official end of the American frontier, we would send a man to the moon, one of the most incredible examples of American ingenuity. Outer space, our grandest calling yet, by no coincidence, known as the final frontier, a name that draws an inherent connection between the American spirit of exploration from the frontier settlers to the astronauts. During his 1960 presidential campaign, John F. Kennedy seized upon Wild West imagery by promoting the new frontier, a call to tackle the economic and social issues of the day with the attitudes and spirit of the American pioneers, or at least the popular perception of it.
But the new frontier of which I speak is not a set of promises. It is a set of challenges. It sums up not what I intend to offer to the American people, but what I intend to ask of them. The new frontier is here, whether we seek it or not. Beyond that frontier are uncharted areas of science and space, unsolved problems of peace and war, unconquered province of ignorance and prejudice, unanswered questions of poverty and surplus.
In the frontier myth, the disappearance of native people was just part of the taming of the so-called Wild West. We're not killing people and taking their land, we're simply protecting our women and children from these brutal savages. Manifest Destiny was the idea that the United States would, through a moral crusade, expand its borders across the entire continent, civilizing everything that was in its path. First, through groups of wagons that followed along famous routes such as the Oregon Trail, and later by train following the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Historian Frederick Jackson Turner was one of the most important voices in the establishment of the Wild West myth and American exceptionalism as a whole, drawing a connection between the settlement of the West and how it informs the American character. Turner argued that American identity was forged on the frontier line as people continued venturing further and further west, expanding the line of American civilization. He wasn't the first person to have these ideas, far from it, but he was the first to lament the closure of the frontier in such a nostalgic way, fearful of what a future free from further expansion would do to the American psyche. Following his frontier thesis, the United States saw a massive explosion of frontier fiction, namely Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West Show, a production that romanticized the heroism of the frontier while omitting its hardships. William F. Cody, commonly known as Buffalo Bill, got his name for claiming to have killed 4,000 buffalo on the American frontier. As the United States expanded westward, we sought ways to get rid of the natives still fighting back against us. General Sherman noticed that the natives we were after followed the herds of buffalo that had defined the land. So it was simple. Kill the buffalo. As wealthy men from across the nation and even Europe ventured out for a chance to hunt the iconic American animal, Buffalo Bill saw an opportunity for profit. He began to travel back east, performing small stage shows based on his exploits. Here, he wildly exaggerated his own adventures and accomplishments, including a story of his scalping a Native American warrior, or as he would tell you, a great Native American chief. The show grew in scale, becoming an intricate production that advertised itself as a living historical account. It portrayed Native Americans as aggressive attackers who were constantly harassing the peaceful settlers. In reality, Native attacks had been quite rare. Cody's production presented white men heroically defeating the evil Indians who stood in the way of progress and self-realization. As the Wild West faded away, Cody's show, which began in the 1880s along with the Turner thesis, which was published in 1893, would be major factors in the rise of the American frontier myth. In a short few decades, Hollywood would push the American Western into theaters all across the country, reinforcing the same narratives into the hearts and minds of Americans from sea to shining sea. As I drove through the countless twists and turns that I'm so unaccustomed to, climbing up and down thousands of feet of altitude, I kept thinking of those that made this trek by foot, horse, and wagon, the difficulty of their journeys, and the countless stories that echo throughout the grounds of the hundreds of miles we passed through. Turner and Roosevelt differ in that Turner saw settlement of the frontier as a defining aspect of the American character, while Roosevelt placed a greater importance on the battles through which the frontier had been won. After the end of the American frontier, the United States continued its expansion by becoming a colonial power. It would defeat Spain, one of the great European nations, in the Spanish-American War, taking the territories of Puerto Rico, Cuba, and etc., cementing its place among the great powers of the world. As I stood there, overlooking one of this nation's greatest natural marvels, I couldn't help but consider the pain and suffering that led to our ownership of it. Despite our country's rapid development, the American West still represents a degree of hope and possibilities. Countless people, myself included, remain enamored by the old frontier, its vast, unparalleled beauty, and its significant place in our history. Stories like that of Theodore Roosevelt, despite all of his faults, remind us of the strength of the indomitable human spirit. As Horace Greeley said in a New York Times editorial, "Washington is not a place to live in. The rents are high, the food is bad, the dust is disgusting, and the morals are deplorable. Go west, young man. Go west and grow up with the country." This video isn't meant to just be America bad. Far from it. I love this nation, and despite not having been born here, I was certainly molded by it. I have a deep sense of patriotism, and I myself remain enamored by the American character. But it's not patriotic to sanitize your own history. It's our duty to study, to learn about it, and to learn from it. We've built a great country, but like all powerful nations, it was built on the back of mass suffering. Sins such as the mass slaughter and assimilation of the natives are uncomfortable realities we all have to live with. Historian Richard Slotkin, who has done a lot of incredible work on American identity, wrote a great piece for the Yale Review this year, where he argued that partisan polarization is due in part to us having different versions of American mythology. He argues that a lot of the disconnect between us comes from the quote-unquote war of stories. Constructing a satisfying and coherent national myth is challenging for the left, because its ideology is based on a critique of America's historical practices of capitalist exploitation of land and labor, racial discrimination, indigenous dispossession, and imperialism. Conservatives have a point when they worry that a full confession of America's past failings might make patriotism suspect. I would argue that the acknowledgement of historical injustice shouldn't take away from national identity. We are a country that has often fallen short of its promise, but it's still a promise we seek to fulfill. We should carry on the best aspects of the American tradition, recognizing where we failed and making an effort to shape that tradition for future generations. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like, comment, or subscribing down below. It really is a huge help. If you're feeling extra generous and want to help out the channel even more, you can support me on Patreon or through a YouTube channel membership, which is also a huge help. You can get the videos a whole week early and also have your name mentioned at the end credits. Speaking of which, special thanks go out to Bobbletopia, Michael Lowe, John Reynolds, Luke Johns, Braden Shelby, Kenneth Choi, and Crib Steck. I'll see you guys next time.